Te moana nui a kiwa, the Pacific Ocean. This body of water is so huge, you could drop every piece of land on Earth inside it and still have some room around the edges. The ancient Polynesian people who first explored this ocean were pretty extraordinary, and we still don't know how or why they did it.
One thing we do know is that this land we're on now was their final discovery. Adapting to life in Aotearoa might have been the biggest challenge Polynesians had ever faced. And today we're going to look at how they did it.
Ko William Ray tēnei.
Ko li Marama McLaughlin tēnei.
Welcome to the Aotearoa History Show.
This story starts about 5,000 years ago. Somewhere on the coast of Southeast Asia, a group of people left their homes and started travelling across the sea.
These were the ancestors of the Polynesian people. We don't know for sure why they started these voyages. Maybe they were trying to escape famine or war. Maybe they just wanted to see what was on the other side of the horizon.
At first, these were short trips using rafts or small canoes to reach nearby islands like Taiwan, Indonesia, the Philippines, Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands.
For a few thousand years, these people travelled around those islands, exploring, trading, forming relationships with local indigenous people, and somewhere around this time they invented a new technology, the ocean-going waka.
This technology probably evolved in stages. First you have your basic waka, then you add an outrigger to make it more stable. Then you go double-hulled, which adds even more stability. Finally, you add a sail, so you don't have to paddle anymore.
Ocean-going waka allowed early Polynesians to make much longer voyages, and they developed all kinds of techniques to navigate across the open ocean. Over hundreds of years, they explored all the way from Hawaii in the north to Rapa Nui in the west. Some researchers think they might have even made it as far as South America.
Every group of Polynesians who settled on one of these islands went on to develop its own distinct culture, but you can still see their shared roots. Aotearoa was the last group of islands to be discovered by Polynesians. Actually, it was the last major landmass anywhere in the world to be inhabited by humans.
Our best guess is this probably started around 1280 or 90. That's based on a combination of climate data, radiocarbon dating and oral histories.
One theory is that the voyage to Aotearoa was kicked off by a gigantic volcanic eruption in Indonesia in 1257, which cooled the entire globe and caused crop failures all over the Pacific.
And this lines up with Māori oral histories. Many iwi say their ancestors were forced to leave their home islands by increasing warfare. Maybe people were fighting over a limited food supply.
According to one tradition, New Zealand was discovered by the great explorer Kupe and his wife Hine Te Aparangi. Their waka was chasing Weke a Muturangi, a giant octopus who had been stealing their fish. But in the middle of this chase, they stumbled across a giant island. Hine Te Aparangi named it Aotearoa, after the long white cloud she saw hanging over the land. This is one of many traditions about discovery and naming, and these traditions have changed over time. For example, Aotearoa probably originally referred to what we now call the North Island, but the name is now expanded to include all of the islands of New Zealand.
There were probably several waves of migration to Aotearoa, somewhere between 12 or 25 waka carrying at least 150 people. Māori oral traditions refer to fleets of waka coming to Aotearoa from a place called Hawaii.
Hawaii is deeply significant to Māori. We talk about it all the time as a spiritual place. Our researchers have been debating for a very long time about where exactly Hawaii was, but they now mostly agree that it refers to several different islands around modern-day Tahiti and Rarotonga. This is based on stuff like language analysis, climate studies and DNA sequencing. It's also backed up by fragments of oral histories. For example, there's a very old wakatoki which says, "E kore au e ngaro he kākano I ruia mai I Rangiatea. I shall never be lost, for I am a seed scattered from Rangiatea." Now, Rangiatea is the Māori name for Raiatea, an island near Tahiti, So that might be one of the islands Māori refer to as Hawaii.
Researchers like Athol Anderson think prevailing winds would have made it extremely difficult to sail back to eastern Polynesia from Aotearoa. Mostly, the people who arrived here were stuck for good.
Māori eventually abandoned long-distance sailing. One of the final voyages was a small group of people who sailed from mainland New Zealand to settle in Rekohu, the Chatham Islands. These people called themselves Moriori, and they developed a unique culture based on the local environment. It was too cold to grow crops, so they relied almost entirely on kaimoana for food. There wasn't much good timber or stone for carving, so instead they created rako momori, carvings and living trees. Around the year 1500, a prominent Moriori chief, Tangata Whenua, ended intertribal conflict among the Moriori and outlawed killing, warfare and cannibalism. From that point on, the Moriori became strictly pacifists.
Right now, in the comments section of this video, someone is writing something about how the Moriori were the real indigenous people of Aotearoa who were wiped out by the Māori.
If that's you, please just don't. These are real people who are still around today, and they're sick and tired of being told they no longer exist.
Yeah, that's a racist colonial myth that's been around since the late 1800s. It fit with 19th century European ideas about superior and inferior races. It also helped Pākehā feel more comfortable about their own colonisation of New Zealand. After all, if Māori conquered the Moriori, it's okay for us to conquer the Māori.
So it's not surprising the Moriori myth was very popular. It was taught in schools for most of the 20th century. A lot of people still believe it today.
But it's not true. It was first debunked by academics way back in the 1920s. All the evidence shows Māori and Moriori both descend from the same original Polynesians who discovered Aotearoa. Skeletal evidence, language analysis, DNA.
So we're all on the same page? Dealt with that? Ready to move on?
Yeah.
For early Polynesian explorers, arriving in Aotearoa would have been busy.
For one thing, it was huge. The islands of New Zealand are 10 times bigger than all the other islands of Polynesia combined.
And this land was full of stuff Polynesians had never seen before.
Snow-covered mountains,
Bubbling mud pools.
enormous trees and gigantic birds.
But the biggest difference was the climate. It's way colder here.
Polynesians brought crops with them from the Pacific, taro, paper mulberry and kumara. It took a lot of experimentation to keep those tropical plants alive through a New Zealand winter.
Luckily, they didn't need those crops to avoid starving, because Aotearoa was jam-packed with kai.
The forests were full of flightless birds, which had no experience dealing with predators on land.
Archaeologists have found the rubbish dumps of early Māori, and they are overflowing with bones of flightless birds, particularly moa bones. Moa were central to the lives of Māori for more than 100 years. They ate them, their bones were carved into fish hooks and ornaments, their feathers were woven into cloaks to protect against the cold.
The word moa is actually the same word Māori originally used for chicken, but there's a big difference between a moa and a chicken. Your average chicken can lay up to 300 eggs a year. You can kill and eat a lot of chickens, and the population will bounce back pretty quickly.
But you can't do the same thing with moa. Moa only laid 1 or 2 eggs a year. This made them very vulnerable to extinction, and Māori don't seem to have realised this until it was too late.
Within a few hundred years of humans arriving in Aotearoa, 32 species of bird were driven to extinction, including all 9 species of moa, plus several other flightless birds like the adsbill, the native New Zealand goose and pelican.
This wasn't just down to hunting. The extinctions were also driven by introduced rats and dogs, which ate birds' eggs.
Archaeologists and geologists have found layers of ash, which suggest huge fires ripped through New Zealand's bush around this time. They were probably lit deliberately to flush the last few birds out of hiding.
These extinctions left a lasting impression on Māori. 300 years later, when Europeans arrived in Aotearoa, Māori still had a wakatauki mourning the loss of the moa. Kua ngaro pērā I te ngaro o te moa. Gone as the moa is gone.
There's a similar saying in English, dead as a dodo.
From the 1500s on, Māori had to find different sources of kai. They focused less on hunting birds and more on agriculture and kaimoana. There was more emphasis on kaitiakitanga, the sustainable management of natural resources. There was also an increase in warfare as people fought over the best sources of kai.
Before this point, Māori had mostly lived in small camps, which only lasted until the local food sources were exhausted. But now they needed larger, more permanent settlements so they could stick close to their crops and defend them from outsiders. This is the point where Māori started building pā, fortified areas which people could retreat to if they were attacked. At least that's what happened to the North Island. Most of the South Island was too cold for growing crops, so tribes down south still had to keep moving, harvesting seasonal sources of kai.
Over time, Māori developed oral traditions which reinforced connections to the land, which sustained the tribe. Often these traditions referred back to the arrival of their tupuna in Aotearoa. For example, when the waka Te Arawa arrived in the Bay of Plenty, Tama Te Kapua, who captained, sprang up and pointed out to the headland which juts out into the sea at Maketu and said, "That point there is the bridge of my nose." It said that by claiming the land to be part of his body, he made it sacred, and the claim was recognised by everyone on board. Connections to land and ancestry were also encoded in visual art forms. These patterns were carved into wood or pounamu or even directly into the skin through tāmoko.
Over time, Māori developed their own traditions and way of doing things different from their Polynesian ancestors. That stuff's really important for understanding Māori history from this point on, so it's time for a super quick tikanga Māori crash course.
The basic unit of Māori life is the wānau, the family group.
Then there's the hapu, the tribe. This was a network of families who usually lived together in the same village.
Finally, there's the iwi. This is a confederation of hapu who all descend from the same waka or foundational ancestor. These connections told Māori who they were and where they'd come from, who they could reach out to for help, both in peace and wartime.
Within Māori society, there were divisions based on class. At the bottom level were the slaves, taurekareka. But this wasn't slavery like we think about it today. These were enemies captured in battle who were sort of absorbed into the tribe of their captives. Above them were the tutua, or ware, the common people, and then at the very top were the rangatira, the chiefs.
It's tempting to think of rangatira like kings or lords because their titles were passed down from parent to child, but it was more democratic than that. Rangatira had to consult with their people about important decisions, and usually they respected the will of the majority.
Alongside the other three classes were the tohunga, the expert class.
These people were like living spiritual libraries. They passed down their iwi's accumulated knowledge, their tribal history and wakapapa, where to fish or hunt, how to carve a warenui, how to heal illnesses, how to deal with supernatural forces.
Day-to-day life was built around interlocking spiritual and cultural concepts. There are lots of these concepts, but we're going to focus on three of the major ones: mana, tapu, and utu.
Okay, so mana is partly related to your status. It can be inherited from your ancestors and enhanced by the way you act in life. If you were a great warrior or a skilled weaver, that would increase your mana. But if you were lazy or rude or just generally a bit useless, that would degrade your mana.
Mana also means authority or respect. There are stories of rangatira who had so much mana they could scare their enemies into running away, even if they were outnumbered 10 to 1.
Next, we have tapu. You could translate this as sacred or forbidden. Violating tapu risks offending the gods and they could make you sick or even kill you. Finally, there's utu. Utu is the principle of balance or getting even. If someone gives you a gift, utu demands you give them a gift in return. If someone attacks you, utu demands you settle the score.
Utu, tapu, and mana were important for day-to-day life. Mana helped maintain social bonds. It encouraged you to work harmoniously to increase your personal mana and the shared mana of the tribe.
Tapu was there to protect people from supernatural forces and from practical stuff. Like it's tapu to sit on a table, but that's also to do with hygiene and keeping our kai away from our butts. Hitting heads is tapu because your head has your brain in it. And rahui, when someone dies in the river, is a form of tapu, so people don't eat fish or eel that have been feeding on human remains.
Yeah. Finally, utu encouraged you to pay your debts.
However, Māori society wasn't a perfect utopia. Oral traditions of Māori warfare can be pretty horrific. Defeated enemies were often eaten, not because they were hungry, but as a way of absorbing their mana.
But that doesn't make Māori culture unusually barbaric or evil. Every culture has skeletons in their closet.
Also, we should be careful about seeing Māori as all the same. Māori have a lot of shared heritage, but iwi also have distinct cultures and traditions, different styles of carving, different legends, and local dialects of te reo Māori. Like, you might notice me saying words like wānau and wakapapa, when it's normally said as whānau and whakapapa. I'm not saying it wrong, that's just my local dialect from Whanganui.
Māori spent about 500 years developing ways of living in this whenua. There was trading, warfare, alliance, betrayal, feasting, famine, natural disaster, migration, discovery.
The population grew from a few hundred to about 80 or 100,000. Some estimates have put the number as high as 200,000.
Most people lived in northern parts of the North Island where it was warmer and easier to grow crops. By modern standards, your average Māori had a pretty hard life. Many people suffered arthritis from paddling waka and carrying heavy loads on their backs. They often developed serious dental problems because their food was full of grit and tough fibres. Average life expectancy was about 28 years. And that might sound short, but it's roughly the same as Europeans in the same time period.
500 years after arriving in Aotearoa, New Zealand's largest land animals were gone, but the bush teemed with birds. The largest kahikatea trees reached 80 metres into the sky and the sea was full of fish. And up until this point in history, nobody in Aotearoa needed to use the word Māori to refer to themselves. The word Māori literally just means ordinary, and no one had ever met anybody who didn't meet that description.
But in 1642, Tangata Whenua saw something totally new. Somewhere near the northern tip of the South Island, billowing white sails appeared on the horizon.
Māori were about to have their very first encounter with Europeans, and that encounter was not going to end well.
But that's a story for the next episode. Thanks for joining us on the Aotearoa History Show, produced by RNZ and made possible by the RNZ New Zealand On Air Digital Innovation Fund.